Hi, I'm Sara.
And I'm Rena, and welcome to
Biopic, a podcast story. This is a podcast where we dissect the good, bad, ugly, and absurd of this specific genre of motion picture, the biopic. If you want to learn more about us, our scoring system, and how we choose movies, please check out our special introductory episode titled Introduction, Who Are We and What Are We Doing?
Sara. What movie are we doing this week?
This week, in honor of Rena's birthday, we will be talking about Lisztomania, directed by Ken Russell and starring rock star Roger Daltrey, the lead singer from The Who, as Franz Liszt, because Roger Daltrey and Rena were both born on March 1st, several decades apart. We are excited to welcome our fourth guest star, Elana Levin of the Graphic Policy Radio, a podcast that examines comics and comic-adjacent media through a queer, leftist, social, political lens. They also host Deep Space Dive, a Star Trek Deep Space Nine podcast where policy wonks, labor organizers, and other experts dive into the themes of Trek's most political series. They have written about film and TV for Wired and written some award-winning music essays you can find on their Medium page. They were just on Popcorn Eschaton podcast to talk Blue Velvet and Reserved Recommendations podcast to talk about hair metal. Elana will probably go on your podcast to talk about hair metal since that was the fourth podcast they've guested on that topic, including Junk Filter, which they'll soon be on to talk about Graham Parsons. Obviously, their first paid music writing job was back in college for the legendary goth magazine Propaganda in 2000. Elana teaches digital strategy to nonprofit organizations and won't call Twitter X because X is a punk band from LA. And you can follow Elana Levin on Blue Sky at Levin. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. I love the show. I enjoyed a great deal. And obviously, I'm here because of my deep, in-depth knowledge of romantic composers. Obviously not. I just was like, how can I make it very clear what my orientation is to the material here from my bio? And I'm like, yeah, no, I'm 100% here because it's a Ken Russell film with a soundtrack by Rick Wakeman from Yes, starring Roger Daltrey. So I'm excited to talk with you guys because I really do love the show.
Welcome. We're so glad to have you.
So, Elana, thank you so much for doing my birthday show. Sara and I know each other because our moms, who were Ithaca College class of 72, sent us on a blind friend date 20 years ago. Elana and I met a few years later through a group of nerds who gathered every week to watch Battlestar Galactica together. We subsequently bonded over a long list of shared interests, including our mutual appreciation for Liberty of London Paisley prints, except that I prefer the ones that make me feel like I am lost in a Victorian kaleidoscope, and Elana prefers the ones that look like the acid trip that Brian Jones would have while looking into my Victorian kaleidoscope. And there is a beloved photo of us arm in arm on Halloween of 2009, where they are dressed as an incarnation of Alice Cooper, and I am dressed as Elizabeth Bennet from Pride and Prejudice. A note to our listeners, Sara and Elana have never met because somehow my friend groups never run into each other. At some point, you can have a duel to see who knows me better, but I doubt that this is the time or the place, because we have a movie to talk about.
Before we get started, Elana, I would love to just ask you a few questions. Is there a biopic that you wish would be made?
Yes, I am working on something about the life of Roz Williams, who is the founder of Christian, and not a film, but it could be a film if I had the capacity to do such a thing, who is the founder of the seminal death rock band Christian Death. And I think that we need to have more work in the world that preserves the artistic and creative legacy of queer artists, especially those who were working in the dawn of the AIDS crisis and dealing with subjects like blood and purity and death, which is all very, very much things we're thinking about and talking about today, and yet has been written out of both the narrative of music history in general, but also queer music specifically, because people are not cool with heavy music, which is unfortunate. So would love to do something about Roz. Yeah.
I love that. And then I have been listening to some of your previous episodes, and one of the things I learned was that you got into comics by reading comic strips in the newspaper. And I am curious, as someone in your general peer range, what comic did you think was the best when you were growing up?
When I was a kid, it was Bloom County.
Oh.
Right? Okay. But what I really have strong associations with reading later is Doonesbury in like junior high, wherein I learned so much about American history by reading old Doonesbury comics. So I was like, oh, I know who the mayor of Philadelphia was in the 60s. And I like have an opinion about him because I read a comic about it, because they had these compendiums you could just get. So those were my big ones.
Cool. I wanted to call out, I have put a pin in Al Pacino for a couple of mind-boggling pieces of trivia coming up in this episode. But another thing you do on your podcast all the time, because I was listening to the Dick Tracy episode most recently, you talk so well and so accessibly about the intersection of comics and how they explain kind of the politics of the moment, and also how those comics explain our history. What would you recommend if someone wanted to start getting into this space and into this ecosystem? Where would you recommend someone begin?
Well, I think people who listen to this podcast have an interest in biography, I would imagine, right? And I thought that the biographical comic about Bela Lugosi that I read a little while ago was very accessible, really good, well done.
Okay.
The book is called Lugosi, The Rise and Fall of Hollywood's Dracula by Shadmi Koren. And, Bela Lugosi was a union leader and an actor and a very interesting human being.
And also, like Franz Liszt, one of Hungary's favorite sons.
There's also a really cool book about David Bowie that was covering the early part of his music career, called Moon Age Daydream. That's from one of the best comics artists living, who's Mike Allred and Laura Allred. And Moon Age Daydream is just sumptuous, psychedelic, wonderful art. And everybody looks really pretty. And it's not super narrative, so if that's what you need, then maybe it's not for you. But if that's a topic that you're interested in, I see you wearing a Bowie t-shirt, another shared interest of ours. Yes. That's definitely a book I would recommend.
Cool. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. I guess without further ado, Rena, should we start talking about this movie? And can you give us the trigger warning?
This movie contains bizarre historical anachronisms, as well as sex, nudity, anti-Semitism, vampires, creepy dolls, an appearance by at least one future Brexit supporter, and modern lyrics superimposed on the music of Franz Liszt for a low-charting soundtrack album.
I think that covers it. Rena, can you give us the spoiler warning?
Oh, Sarah, can I ever? Spoiler warning! We are going to spoil everything, including possibly the major plot points in works of narrative art having nothing to do with this particular movie. Consider yourself warned. I love spoilers.
Some of the sources used in this episode, and these were all things that Rena read, include Franz Liszt, musician, celebrity, superstar; Being Wagner, the story of the most provocative composer who ever lived, by Simon Callow. And then also the Biographers podcast did a 6-episode series on Franz Liszt. And I spent a lot of time on the internet reading reviews of this movie from when it came out, as well as appreciations through the years on everything from The Guardian to Rotten Tomatoes.
I guess for historic sources, for me, I would definitely point towards for one of my favorite podcasts, A History of Rock and Roll and the 500 Songs, only has one episode about The Who out, but you should listen to its episode about The Who, because as a person who's been interested in The Who for a long time and has learned lots of things that aren't true, this was a very helpful piece of insight into the early period of their, the earliest period of their career.
Cool.
And when he eventually gets to the mid-period of their career, I'm sure it'll be excellent too. So
excellent.
Also, in terms of Wagner, my father is a huge opera fan, and some of my treasured memories are of attending the Metropolitan Opera House with him, where he shared his love of Wagner and the Ring Cycle with me. So I have personal experience with the complications and the mental gymnastics of being Jewish while enjoying Richard Wagner's music.
Rena, can you tell us just a little bit about Franz Liszt?
So, quite briefly, Franz Liszt was born on October 22nd, 1811, in a village in Hungary, which was then part of the Austrian Empire. The name of the village appears to vary depending on whether you ask the Austrians or the Hungarians. Liszt considered himself Hungarian, but never learned the language. He was an adorable but sickly child prodigy. One of his tutors was Antonio Salieri, who we will meet when we get to Amadeus. Salieri is not even the first in a long list of major names who would cross paths with Franz Liszt throughout his life. He began publishing his compositions at the age of 11. His music was wildly influential. I would highly recommend that you go listen to the podcast, The Biographers, where they did a 6-part series on Liszt, and they do a wonderful job explaining what made his music special in a way that I can't summarize here. Liszt has been called the first rock star and had a number of performance moves that line up with that. He would toss his hair out of his face while playing, and was probably the first concert pianist to position the piano so that he could see the audience. The custom before his time was to play in profile to the audience. His concerts were enormous events where women would scream and fight over silk handkerchiefs that he tossed into the crowd. This was also a move of Elvis Presley's, where he would throw his scarf into the crowd. Women would save and bottle the backwash from glasses that he drank out of. He was a big man-ho. From the time he was 15 on, women threw themselves at him. He had at least 3 illegitimate children that we know of, but the estimated numbers, based on descendant claims and circumstantial evidence, has been as high as 3 dozen. He is, I think, now underappreciated as a composer, and I would lay the blame for this on the fact that the Wagner family are the guardians of his cultural estate, and his daughter Cosima was awful. I was going to close this by saying that his grandchildren were all Nazis, but then I remembered that that might not be fair, because Liszt may have had as many as 3 dozen illegitimate children all over Europe. So I hope that the odds are that at least one of his grandchildren or great-grandchildren was in the resistance. We know that he toured Great Britain, so hopefully, maybe he had a descendant in the army of the good guys. I hope so, because it makes me sad to get to the end of his life and reflect that his direct descendants were Nazis. Also, Sara and Elana, as the pop culture and film people here, can you please discuss Ken Russell, my birthday twin Roger Daltrey, and how the hell Lisztomania happened?
So when you asked me what movie I wanted to cover on the podcast, I was like, I don't really know. I don't have a ton of thoughts about biopics myself, but I'm like, but I would totally talk about Lisztomania. And I felt like I caveated it to be like, it's not really a traditional biopic, but I don't know how much of that sat as a part of my description. And I hope that I didn't completely break the format of your podcast. Okay, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, so Ken Russell, though, right, he came to prominence after having made like a dozen documentaries about artists for the BBC. And prior to even working for the BBC, he was making self-made films about artists. Like, making films about artists is what Ken Russell is really into doing. He did that in like a shoestring budget for the BBC for years. He eventually has a breakout hit with Women in Love, which is impossible to find streaming, and groundbreaking for a number of reasons, including male nudity. So just like bear that in mind as we observe all of the wonderful nudity of this movie, that he was groundbreaking in egalitarian nudity in his films. But he's always been a very independent, creative, out there director, while his other biopics that he has made, I have not been able to see in length any of the other biopics that he has made of other composers, because the American audience has never been like drawn to see any of this. And so we're saying like, oh wow, this is this director who clearly doesn't like care about biography. We don't fucking know, because we don't have access to his more traditional documentary work that he did before that. Now, I know from reading, and I'm sure this is stuff Sara researched as well, it's not like all of his earlier documentaries were considered like, oh yeah, this is completely like slice of life, fully accurate. But it also sounded like some of the criticisms that people had of them were rooted in being discomfortable about talking about like artists as like sexual beings. And like, that ain't his fault. That's your problem. So I feel that it's hard for us to say, I don't want to completely assume that this is representative of his approach to autobiography in general, when I can't speak to, but I can speak to his films at large. I have seen many of his films that are available to us, including which we can talk about those later. But like, I understand that this film is not for everybody. I enjoyed it, and I would not have suggested it otherwise. So my understanding is that, you know, you have some feelings about the film as well. Ken Russell is very divisive. A lot of people dislike his work. He has a cult following. He did a lot of really independent work, and it is most well known in America for his rock musical Tommy, which is what he did immediately preceding this film. And he liked working with Roger Daltrey so much and he'd been interested in doing a film around the theme of pop star Messiah before he even met The Who. But he didn't know shit about rock and roll, really. So he was like, oh, good, here's a rock band that I can like do this with, who's written a rock musical about this topic. So they kind of needed each other. Like The Who needed a film director, and he needed like a rock band because Ken Russell is a classical music guy, actually. Even he's, you know, born in 1927. Like, this is an old guy, right? And sort of like my beloved Jack Kirby, this is like a greatest generation guy who just was really excited and into shit from the 60s and 70s and like understood that psychedelic aesthetic in a deep way, even though that was not of his generation. He and Daltrey had a real partnership after that. And he was like convinced that Daltrey looked like Liszt. And that was one of the reasons why this movie came to be. And Daltrey had just recently hired someone to teach him piano, like the year before Tommy began. So he was ready to go.
Yes.
I guess that was a combination of Roger Daltrey and Ken Russell bio there.
No, that was perfect. Okay. This actually dovetails perfectly into where my notes begin on this. 1975 musical film. Which is a statement that tells so little of what we are about to experience. Budget was really low for a movie, even of that time period. It was a $1 million budget. If I recall correctly, the budget for Tommy was only like $3 million. Like he gets a product in and out real fast in terms of budget. The first time, Rena, you and I discussed Ken Russell, and the first encounter we had with him was when we were talking about the movie Evita and its road to the cinema. And it had a detour in Ken Russell's court, where he was attached to direct the movie for about a year, I think, with Elaine Page playing Evita. And I want to say up top, before we even get into any of this, I loved this movie. I love an artist swinging for the fences. I love an uncompromising vision. I will watch Lisztomania all day long before I will be like, oh, can I watch Walk the Line? One of the things you mentioned, Elana, and I'm going to just add to this too, this is my personal experience with Ken Russell, is I feel profoundly unsafe when I'm about to watch one of his movies. I don't know what's about to happen to me, because he just takes things in such a weird direction sometimes. And I feel like shares things with us that I'm like, maybe talk to someone before you put it in a movie. But he also just uncompromising artist who puts it all out there every time, leaves it all on the floor. And I have a ton of respect for that. Where this movie began is that a producer named David Putnam, who is the producer of the films Chariots of Fire, The Mission, The Killing Fields, Midnight Express, and Lisztomania. He, in the 70s, ran a production company called Good Times, which was one word. And he partnered with Ken Russell with a plan to make 6 movies about different composers. So this included Liszt, George Gershwin, Berlioz, Vaughan Williams, and they made their first one, which was Mahler, which was successful enough to move on to the next one. And Putnam wanted the next one to be about Gershwin, and he wanted one Sir Al Pacino to play George Gershwin. And Elana, I know you love him.
I do.
I like every movie that Ken Russell has been talked about making. I kind of want to live in a world where a version like where that movie exists. Like I want to see Ken Russell's Evita. I also want to see his movie about Gershwin starring Al Pacino very badly.
Wow.
Right?
Well, both Gershwin and Al Pacino are American. And I'm sure that felt very significant to the British,
yes.
team, for example. So there you go.
I'm very interested in this movie, but Ken Russell wanted to do Liszt, and Ken Russell won that fight. Ken Russell initially wanted Mick Jagger for this before he met Roger Daltrey and started his partnership with him. Reportedly, Ken Russell never finished the script for this, and I think that shows. The final shooting script was 57 pages long, which is scant. Usually a movie film script is roughly a minute a page. So we're working with optimistically 57 minutes of material written down. Putnam is quoted as saying the problem was he never finished his screenplay, and frankly, he just seemed to go off his rocker. Russell said he was most intrigued by Liszt's relationship with Wagner, but Putnam was, quote, more at home at a pop concert than in the concert hall. He threw out my first script for being too straight and urged me to write another, emphasizing the pop element. So I guess he just was like, I'm not going to finish this. And because it was the 70s and because there was cocaine, they just went for it. This was the last movie they would make together. It was a box office failure. I couldn't find the box office numbers, but given that it cost $1 million to make, I struggle to understand how bad was it, because that's not a huge output of money.
I will say that, as Rena mentioned earlier, it was a low charting soundtrack. Rick Wakeman, who did the score for the film, was the biggest shit in the fucking world in 75. So the fact that the score didn't sell really well is interesting. Now, Rick Wakeman will tell you that it's because the final soundtrack recording production is really bad. I don't know what his rubric is for saying that, but he basically is like, my music's good. This sounds like shit. I would eventually like to go and fix it. Has been his line on it. But Rick Wakeman's soundtrack doing badly in 75 is kind of like if a Trent Reznor soundtrack did badly in the late 90s. You're like, oh, you're the cool thing that people are really into. Huh. And I think I don't want to assume any knowledge of prog rock amongst the listeners, because if you're part of our generation, you probably spent most of your life being told that prog rock was for assholes, or perhaps it was only for men, or perhaps it was only for people who've never had sex before. What you should know is that back in the mid-70s, prog rock was some of the most popular music in England and America that tons of people listened to. These were gold platinum records, and Rick Wakeman had been in the business of adapting classical music to make it prog since before this. Having Rick Wakeman do the soundtrack, it makes perfect sense. If you were well, why didn't Roger Daltrey do it? You're just that's not what Roger, because he's with The Who. They do something else. Rick Wakeman, however, does classical music adaptations into popular music. He does that. That's his thing. And he had just been doing a series of narrative concept albums around such topics as the Six Wives of Henry VIII, Six Wives of Henry VIII, which charted very well and is very good, and a whole couple series of Arthuriana albums. And you may know him from his work with the rock band, the prog rock band Yes. So to me, the fact that the soundtrack wasn't big is saying something. But I will tell you, I think it's good, and I think that people should listen to it. There are a few songs on it that are very good. That's what.
Yeah, I thought that the sound of the movie, it wasn't all for me, but it was very good. I can understand why someone who actually understands what they're talking about would think that it didn't sound good. But I was like, the music feels very polished, and I remember the King Arthur concept album. I watched a ton of VH1 in the 90s because I was a very good babysitter. And I remember them talking about the King Arthur concept album, and I think they did like an ice show of it, maybe. Or
yes, it was an ice-capades. There was an ice-capades of this. Like, is this the most 70s self-indulgent thing that has ever happened? Thy name is Rick Wakeman. He also is famous for having giant capes that he wore in performances that needed to be carried by other people because they weighed so much.
You know what? Like, everybody have a good time. Like, this is wonderful. Do this. Everybody do this stuff.
Rick Wakeman is never anything less than the most Rick Wakeman that Rick Wakeman can be. And in that way, he's very much like Ken Russell. They very much liked working together, and they did work together again later on in the 80s. Rick Wakeman has an Order of the British Empire, thing. He's a big deal. But yeah, I just think that like everybody our age has been so indoctrinated, in part by things like VH1, that like prog is bad and the enemy of punk rock, etc., etc.
Yes. Well, my chief familiarity with Yes and Rick Wakeman is from that rock and roll PBS multi-part documentary that aired in the 90s, where Yes appears as a thing that punk is there to wash away.
That's very much how the whole genre has been characterized in the popular discourse, and I think it is totally understandable to frame it that way in that time and space, although you'll often find people who you would not suspect to have been fans of that to actually have been fans of that. But I think it's very silly to try to tell people to pick sides in 2025. I'm like, I like them all. It's fine.
Yeah. Everybody should just like things. These are two people who are having a great time.
They're having the best time.
Yeah. David Putnam probably wasn't having the best time, but I think like Ken and Rick were having a really good time.
Rick Wakeman, by the way, says that the film's budget shrunk over the course of them working on it, and like he's like, and Ken is like very line itemy, so he's like, it was getting reduced as they worked on the project, basically.
The idea of like Ken being super line itemy totally tracks too, given his history in like commercials and documentaries, like that kind of tactician. I was wondering too, watching this, I was like, how much of this set just like got shipped over from Pinewood Studios, from the Tommy set?
The Hamer horror stuff might literally be from Hamer horror, like literally. I don't want to jump ahead too far, but that was probably from a different film. But then there's there's some sets that were made for this because you could not possibly have been made for anything else, which we'll talk about later.
The way that everything in their house looks like a Liberace piano.
I want to live in that room. Mm-hmm. Everything in that room, every garment. Incidentally, his first wife, who was working with him on this film, was a costume designer. The entire set of that house with him and Marie, where everything is a piano, it's so 70s and so piano. And I think that the piano became a popular visual motif in design starting in the early 80s. Remember those piano belts and stuff like that?
Yes, and he wears a robe in this that reminds me of the Mugatu piano key tie from Zoolander.
I bring up the piano thing just to say that I think the style of this movie is fashion influential, and the typeface. I mean, Ken Russell just uses the best typefaces for everything. Every single typeface in this movie, I'm just like, oh, put that on my t-shirt.
So two critics I respect, Pauline Kael and Roger Ebert, had very differing views about this film. Both of them sum it up really well. Pauline Kael wrote, Russell is in his element, so far in that who wants to follow him? He's disappearing in a giant crotch too. And then Ebert wrote, it's a berserk exercise of demented genius. And on that level, and I want to make my praise explicit, it functions and sometimes even works. Most people will probably despise
it. Yeah. He seems like a mensch, and he has the most middle-brow taste in the world, which was his job to have. Mm-hmm. So I always enjoy reading him because I'm like, I do not agree with you, but it was interesting to see that. Pauline Kael and I love Pauline Kael, and she's also very wrong plenty of the time, but like sometimes we get each other. But yeah, she does not like Ken Russell. So that was praise. That was praise for her, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
That's more praise from her than she would normally give for him. Mm-hmm. And the kind of the kind of critic who would come to appreciate Ken Russell's work wasn't the kind you were going to read in those sorts of magazines and outlets back when that film came out, because this was fanzine stuff, right? This is counterculture. So they weren't going to be in those, you know?
So Roger Daltrey and I share a birthday, but I am at a loss as to what I have in common with him otherwise, and our sharing a cusp of Pisces birthday backs up my confirmation bias that astrology is garbage pseudoscience. At one point in my life, the proof that I needed to go back to therapy was that I spent $100 on a year's subscription to an astrology app. I am an engineer's daughter. I took that as my impetus to go back to therapy, even though therapy is much more expensive than an astrology app. Can either of you think of anything I have in common with Roger Daltrey that would prove that astrology is onto something?
You both have beautiful curls.
That's genetic.
Man, I should have jumped in first. I share your disgust in astrology. I don't like the idea that the time of when I was born has anything to say about who I am. But I was watching a documentary that included an interview with Roger Daltrey, and The Who were really a seminal band from the mod scene, strongly identified from the British mod scene. And the mod scene had a very specific style guide that you had to abide to or you were out. And it changed over the course of the years of the mod scene. But at all points in time, your hair was straight. And so in this interview, this guy is like, Roger, like, what did you think about, sort of changing from mod fashions to hippie fashions? It's like pretty drastic. And he's like, oh, well, when you were a mod, having curly hair was worse than having VD. So I was really relieved when I could stop straightening it. And I just was like, I have textured hair too, Rena, and I am familiar with the struggles that we have maintained at times to figure out how to have hair with texture in a Goyish world. Roger's like the Goy of all, himself. But like, I thought about like, well, he's someone who's wrestled with these questions of like, how do I want to make my hair work with my broader aesthetic? And he's like, definitely burned his fingers with a fucking iron, right? Like, this is a man who's lived the struggle. He's lived the aesthetic struggle and came out deciding that he was going to have his natural hair, which also is how he ended up getting cast as Liszt in a sense, because that is probably why the director thought that he looked like Liszt. So that's something you have in common. He has great hair. I'm glad he no longer had to iron it, which is very damaging. They didn't even have good products back then. We have it easy now in the aughts, but in the 60s, man, that's brutal. That's all I got for you and Roger Daltrey.
Yeah, I have no idea what I have in common with this man.
I can share various bio facts about him, but none of them have an overlap with you. So there's just really no.
Yeah, astrology disproven.
Mm-hmm. You heard it here, folks. You can stop quoting it at us.
Yep. And with that, let's talk about this movie. So I found this movie to be campy AF. Right up front, camp is not my thing. As an aspiring ally of the LGBTQIA plus community, I appreciate how camp has been a meaningful and joyous thing for them, but camp is not my thing. Sumptuousness is my thing. As I say this, I immediately imagine a drag queen imitating me saying it.
I love
and
it.
I'm also aware that I am judging this film according to rules that it makes no pretense of caring about. I can't love it for what it is, and I can't make it into something it isn't, but I will never forget it. And we watch so many mediocre biopics that play by the rules and are kind of dull, and this is not dull at all.
Yep.
Yeah. I agree with all that you have said. I personally I love camp, but as I mentioned, I feel unsafe watching his work, which I do think is the mark of great artistry. I mean that it's unsafe in a very controlled environment. It's like being on a roller coaster. You don't know what's going to happen, but like it's gonna change you in some way. The look and feel of his movies when you see them.
But we have a lot of regulars in this, though, in general. Ken Russell loves a really unique face, and even when he has really good-looking people, they're usually not bland ones. But there's definitely some extra, like, I know that extra from when I saw them in another film of his, like the face reemerged, you know.
There's like this splendor he takes kind of in sort of like amping up dialing them up to 11 in one way or another. Even if it's someone who's beautiful, you're like, oh, there's just like a little too much happening here with this person's face. Like I'm gonna mention Tommy a lot just because it's my most specific reference point with Ken Russell and Margaret in that movie. Like, she's a very, very beautiful woman, and there's just something about the way he presents her in that movie where she's beautiful, but there's like a tawdriness to it.
She's so gorgeous in that scene where Tommy is conceived, and then he coarsens her over the course of the film until I don't really want to look at her.
That's exactly the kind of work that so stands out with him, is that he's an artist who can do that and like have it work.
And develop a real trust with his actors. Like, to do some of the things that he does with these people, they must trust him. Segueing right into our opening, we open on a shiny metronome, and Roger Daltrey energetically kissing a woman's breasts for a very long period of time to the tempo of the metronome, which he keeps speeding up. And then this is interrupted by a man in a wig with a candelabra coming in to fight him. Rena, I think you had some strong feelings about this man.
This man is supposed to be Marie's husband. He is dressed for the 1780s, even though we are supposed to be in the 1830s. And he tosses Franz a dueling sword. And then we have a ridiculous hoedown style song and dance number, replete with rather puerile dick jokes, as Franz, clad only in a silk diaper made from the bedsheet, duels Marie's husband.
It's very Dukes of Hazzard.
Yes, that was also how Rick described it. Apparently, Ken was like, I just want you to do something really out of the box for the opening song. I don't want people to think that the movie is going to be doing something that would be super strong historicism from the beginning. So do something that's just the opposite of what would be period appropriate. And Rick's like, hoedown, which is not what Rick Wakeman has ever done. Unless I take it back, The Clap is a song by Yes that's kind of hoedowny, but I don't think he wrote it. I think he's doing it to be like, hi, we're not going for realistic, and we want to make sure right off the bat that you understand this, because we don't want you to be like think that this is like accurate. So it's all just a big giant flag of like, we are not trying to be realistic at all.
Designed for people like me.
Well, but aren't you glad that you know that they know it, right? Like, would it be more insidious if it was accurate and then they just changed this one thing to make everybody heterosexual? That's what normally people do in things, and they make everything try to be really realistic, but suddenly everybody's straight, right? So instead, in here, he's like, none of this is trying to be accurate, and I will make it very clear so none of you are confused.
Yeah, it's a strong like shot out of the gate of just saying like, we're about to twist your brain.
And it suddenly becomes an old time silent, movie melodrama with the people tied to the railroad tracks and the train coming. Like, it's a lot of the film jumps between different other film genres and film eras throughout.
So the Comte, actually, Marie's husband's title was Vicomte, but the Comte makes a terrible dad joke about, perhaps this will teach you not to bang on the piano. So I feel some of the English music hall tradition in this, in some of the patter. He stuffs them both into a piano and puts it on the train tracks. His servants are shown nailing the lid of the piano shut. We don't get any answers as to how they avoid being hit by the train. This is never followed up.
I was left wondering about that. It was like, oh, I guess we're just going to leave that alone. And that poor woman ate so many bananas while she was watching all of this unfold.
She was fed on set,
Yeah. Yes.
Something that's both tasty and healthy.
Yeah, because I got questions about what was going on the set when we get to the end of the movie. And children's safety. This goes right up to the moment where the train is about to hit them and he snaps out of it and all of a sudden is backstage at a concert and it was just a dream or a remembrance of an event that probably happened sort of like that, but not really. And we're at behind the scenes of a rock show. It's very 70s decadent party. We're meeting all of these other classical music people.
Richard Wagner is wearing a sailor suit. I don't know why he is wearing a sailor suit. The dialogue in this scene is like a hammy music hall act. Wagner is mad at being compared to Mendelssohn because Wagner is a raging anti-Semite. And Rossini shows up and he's obsessed with making everyone eat chicken legs. And we meet Hector Berlioz, Frédéric Chopin, another birthday twin of mine, along with Harry Belafonte and Justin Bieber, who are not in this movie. And then Levi Strauss shows up, even though he would have been in grade school at this point in time. And we are dropping names like Galileo dropped the orange. Welcome to the show, Lola Montez. You will have your own biopic that we will get to sometime in the next 10 years.
I'm in the present day screaming for an intimacy coordinator because I have now seen Roger Daltrey suck on too many nipples this early in the movie. It seems like everybody's having a good time except Wagner in his weird dirty sailor suit. I should mention here too, Wagner is played by an actor named Paul Nicholas, who played cousin Kevin in Tommy. And he was also the original Rum Tum Tugger in the London cast of Cats.
I think it's cool that they're kind of keeping the antagonist team together from Tommy.
Yeah.
All of the name dropping is spot on. There is a George Sand in this. Liszt really did interact with just about everyone who was anyone. For an example of how all of this worked in his social crowd, and also a story about him being a big man-ho. This is from the Oliver Hilm book, Franz Liszt Superstar. One anecdote in particular says much about their difficult relations. This is about him and Chopin. When Chopin had to leave Paris for several weeks at the beginning of 1835, Liszt asked a favor of him. Chopin's apartment would be empty during his absence, so he wondered if he could use it during that time. Guilelessly, Chopin agreed, unaware that Liszt would use the apartment for secret trysts with Marie Pleyel, who was not only Berlioz's former fiancée, but, to add insult to injury, the wife of Chopin's friend, Camille Pleyel. The affair naturally came to light, and Chopin understandably felt that he had been taken in. Pleyel may also have accused him of placing his apartment at Liszt's disposal in order to let him seduce his wife. Whatever the true facts of the matter, Liszt had emphatically gone too far.
Sounds like it. I don't have anything to add there, except he does sound like he is a big man-ho. He goes on to perform, and this crowd of teen girls is cheering for him, waving their fans. They're demanding that he play chopsticks. He's trying to play a song by Wagner, and then he turns it into chopsticks, and the girls are all like going nuts for that, and Wagner stomps out, and the girls don't like Wagner, and who can blame them? It's not really that sexy of classical music that he puts together.
So I think it's a really cool composition, the way they put together chopsticks and the song and the different themes, and like
it really sounds very cool.
There's also stuff in here that shows that Ken Russell knows his stuff, and that his choice to say the hell with it about doing anything we expect in a biopic on a classical musician, that as a choice is clear here, because there are little things he gets right. That, for example, Liszt did give a benefit concert to build a monument to Beethoven, and that women really did fight over gloves that Liszt threw into the crowd. For anyone who watches reality TV, which I don't, somewhere in here there is an audience member played by Lisa Vanderpump of Real Housewives of Beverly Hills and Vanderpump Rules fame.
Duly noted.
Yeah.
The teeny bopper horde here is like, they just really know how to nail it's the Beatles screaming. And incidentally, Beatlemania is named from Lisztomania.
A good mania is fun. It's fun when everybody just loses their shit over something to an irrational degree.
Liszt was constantly on tour from the time he was a teenager. There was one time where his father had him give like 38 concerts in a month.
Got some real Culkin, yeah,
Yeah.
Culkin family stuff going on here.
Liszt's dad died when he was 15.
Yeah, I think one of the connections really that I think Ken draws with Daltrey also, Daltrey came from a very working class family. And so they're both outsiders who are very excited to have access to kinds of people who they would not have had access to if they weren't so good at their instrument.
Then we cut to a scene where he is having a fight with his wife.
Not his wife.
Marie is not his wife. Marie was married to somebody else, and this meant that the 3 children she had with Liszt were not legally hers, because your children are legally your husband's, and she's still married to this guy. So Liszt's name is on everything, so it's perfectly legal when he gets mad at her later for him to say, yeah, I don't want them to have any contact with you. My mom's going to raise them in Paris. I'm very rarely going to see them myself, but bye-bye, Marie.
I had just figured that they sorted all that shit out, but good to know that they didn't. Because she's the same woman from the beginning, right? I'm really okay.
To be fair, Liszt and Marie are pretty awful parents by modern standards. They're barely around. Liszt leaves his kids with his mom, and they make Cosima the oldest here, but actually she was the second daughter. In terms of that Ken Russell knew his stuff and just chooses not to follow it, the things that they're arguing about or mentioning are true to things that actually happened. And this is where they're in that apartment where everything looks like a Liberace piano.
And her dress is the greatest. Her dress is the greatest dress. That's all there is to say. It's majestic. It's 100% polyester. It exists across time and space. And it has accordion pleats in it. So it's also kind of an instrument as well.
It's an insane dress. Oh my God. I was coveting it I was like, oh my God, look at this dress. While they're fighting, the children are playing on the roof, backing up your comment that they weren't very good parents. They're reading love letters that he had written to Marie long before through the chimney, and he does not appreciate that at all, but it does remind him of their relationship when it started off. We cut to a scene where we're seeing them as like in their early years of the relationship to this song Dream of Love. It gave me Robert Altman's Popeye vibes, another movie that makes me feel incredibly unsafe.
That entire song is based on a theme by Liszt.
The scene looks a lot like a Chaplin silent film.
Oh, 100%. I mean, and I have to say Roger Daltrey is a pretty good Chaplin. It's actually the specific Chaplin film, the Gold Rush movie.
The Gold Rush.
In Gold Rush, they live in a little house that's like that little house from the scene. It's all very, very heart themed. Like you could throw a hell of a Valentine's Day party in the art direction of this scene.
And then we meet Cosima, his daughter, and she has a creepy doll that looks like him. I could probably talk about this doll for the rest of my life.
There's a similar Jim Morrison doll toward the end of The Doors.
What? That's so cursed.
Yeah, this doll is really creepy looking. And of course Cosima sticks needles in it, so we have voodoo going on top of everything else.
Please tell me, I will hold it later, but I think that the child actress is amazing.
I thought for a second that this is the same girl who plays Sally Simpson in Tommy, but it wasn't.
Her name is Veronica Quilligan, and she is an actor who has worked steadily throughout her life. She was in Candle Shoe. She was just in the remake that they did of Papillon, starring Rami Malek. She's very good in this movie. She ages quite a bit and goes through some changes that we'll talk about.
How old is she during this movie, IRL?
IRL, she was like 18 when they were making it, 18, 19 years old. Which is incredible.
As a child in that scene, for sure.
And at this point, he seems to imply that he will sell his soul to the devil in order to be successful. And he goes to visit Princess Carolyn in Russia. We are put into a room upon which all of the walls are covered in sconces that are butts, and those butts start farting. Oliver Reed shows up here in his brief cameo and brings him into the room and leaves him there, and the room fills up with the stench of farts. And this room right here, this is the reason why Ken Russell makes me feel unsafe. Because we meet Carolyn, and she's played by an actress named Sara Kestelman, who's also a working actor. And in this year, she was also in Zardoz. I couldn't help but think about what it was like to go from the set of Zardoz to this. How weird was life in the 70s to be like, I was on the film Zardoz, and now I'm zipping over here to Lisztomania, and I'm in a room full of butts. And soon we'll be in a room full of penises. That is my introduction in this movie. She explains that he doesn't like, or that she doesn't like people smelling like fresh air, which is why she fumigates him in that room. And it doesn't make a lot of sense. And
like, is there something about the real Princess Carolyn having to do with smoke, or like, is there any...
Rena, what do you know about her?
I think she did smoke, but I don't think this has anything to do with that. But she was an enormously wealthy landowner. She did have 30,000 serfs, and I was confused about why is she having issues with the Pope if they're Russian. So the region she was in is one that is owned by the Poles and owned by the Ottomans and owned by the Russians and goes back and forth. So her family is Polish Catholic. And that's why the Pope is a thing in here. It was confusing because I thought, shouldn't they be Greek Orthodox?
Thank you for clarifying that. I was wondering that too. And then I was like, it doesn't matter. This is not Gandhi. Then the next thing we see is that this room is just filled with... I wrote dildos in my notes, but I feel like that is a disservice to the art direction that took place in this scene, because they are giant, sort of a tall statuary.
There's also these like twisty columns that look like the bronze columns on the altar, the Bernini altar at St. Peter's, but there are like large white balls at the bottom of them. Princess Carolyn is quite mean to him. She makes him put on a crinoline. I don't know if this ever happened.
I think she's just being framed as an emasculating woman who took over his life and dominated it in various ways, but who also encouraged him to do certain kinds of music.
People at the time thought she was rather plain, but Liszt liked really smart women who were commanding.
She is that. Because she is immediately laying the ground rules and trying to get him to have sex with her. And then we go into this was the point where I was like, we are on. This is the Ken Russelliest thing that's ever happened, because all of a sudden he shrinks down into a musical number and we're kind of in her vagina. And there's a giant, like we're going in. And then all of a sudden there's this like 8-foot long phallus. It's very anatomically correct, and it's part of the musical number, and everybody's dancing with it, and it's wild. Every other second of this movie, I'm going, what am I watching? Where did he come up with this?
Roger Daltrey is riding a giant penis to greatness while wearing a purple crinoline inside the church of Princess Carolyn's vagina. And the women in his life are pulling him along on the giant penis like they're the furry Alaskan dogs in the Iditarod race. Alana, do you have any input here?
This is all them being like, look, these being his libido and his desire for these women is like leading him on and controlling his life and dictating how he's supposed to do things. It's a pretty straight metaphor. What I think is also interesting is the choreography with the dance with the women from the different aspects of his life. Like he has them building, and I don't know who the choreographer is, building constructions of flame with their arms that I think are really successful at looking like flames constructed from arms. Like there isn't that much choreography in the movie, but when they want to, they can like really fucking do it. So there's some, you know, Bugsy Berkeley musical moments in it, but I just thought that particular touch was really well executed.
Mm-hmm.
I was enchanted and appalled and like fascinated, and I'm like, this is so fun. Why isn't every movie like this? And then there's a giant penis guillotine, and fortunately we snap out of the musical number before that realizes its destiny.
And then we see him interact with Princess Carolyn, who's a lot less deranged than she is in his fantasy of her, you know? I'm not saying she's normal in the next scene, but she's much less outre.
We see he changes his hair. His hair is straight now.
It's a floofy 70s blowout. It looks great on him. They show that this is a time of revolution in Europe, but they have Marie and his two children, the two that are not Cosima, who have not aged, are shown dying in some kind of uprising. This is not what happened. His son Daniel died at about the age of 20 of some kind of 19th century blood coughing up thing, and his other daughter Blondine died young. She had a baby, and then she was breastfeeding the baby, and she had some sort of inflammation / swelling in the breast that got way out of control. I'm not going to read the details. Blondine and Daniel both died young, and he was left with Cosima, who is the worst of his three acknowledged children.
Things start to kind of go really off the rails at this point, which is a real statement given what we've already talked about. We don't get a lot of information about the specifics of this revolution that he's having feelings about, but he does feel some guilt. Wagner shows up to visit him again and reveals himself to be a vampire destined to create music, which, sure, he's a vampire. He bites Liszt on the neck. I think that he doesn't fully convert him.
He does not convert him. He just drains some blood. And the effects on the teeth transition are gorgeous. They did such a good job, right? And then the gums, and it becomes green.
It's a very impressive effect how it's all done. The teeth look very creepy.
Yeah, so Wagner drinks Liszt's blood, which is a decent metaphor for how the Wagner family has behaved for the past 140 years as custodians of Liszt's legacy. Princess Carolyn shows up after Wagner leaves, and she has divorce permission from her husband. We also see Cosima and her husband von Bülow, who would have been a baby in the early scenes that he's also in, but nothing makes sense here anyway with timelines. So she and her baby are running away over a hill of rubble from this revolution thing, and they run into Wagner. And just a thing that Wagner and Liszt were a couple years apart in age, so being Wagner's father-in-law was a situation that Liszt entered into with great reluctance, also because Cosima's first husband, von Bülow, was his protege, kind of, and he really loved his first son-in-law and was not pleased with Richard Wagner at this point.
Who can blame him? He just drank his blood.
Yeah, he sucks. Oh my god. Dad pun.
Oh.
Bad Rena.
We're leaving that in the show.
And he gave him his pamphlet, which is a Superman comic.
Yes.
He's like, here, take my pamphlet, and it's a rolled up Superman comic.
I didn't see that.
We have a rule, the dinosaur rule.
If a human interacts with a dinosaur and it is not a dream sequence, the movie automatically gets a 0 for accuracy when we score it. Stick a pin in that. We'll get to it. Because enter Ringo Starr.
Oh boy. Get out of my sex romp, Ringo Starr.
Why can't Ringo Starr be in your sex romp?
I find his acting very dead-eyed.
He's not great here, but even in the Beatles movies, you don't like him?
He's charming in the Beatles movies. I'm very easily swayed over into loving someone who I express disdain for. Rena has done this many times on this show.
But this is not Ringo's best performance. But I think he's wonderful in the Beatles movies. Like
yes, when he is not looking like someone has a gun on him off set, forcing him to be there. I'm guessing like this was just like a meeting of drugs. I wrote in my notes that it's exactly like that scene in Heat with De Niro and Pacino finally meeting, except it totally isn't.
I think we have different reads of that scene in each other, Sarah. I don't the one from Heat, I mean. I will say though, Ringo's costume is amazing.
Uh-huh.
It is covered in detailed film strip printouts and film photo like it's like printed on celluloid, but it's not the negative, it's the positive, because they want you, the viewer, to be able to read it, of classic cinema up his body, and it's structured like a priest's garment, like it's done in the right style. And right near his chest, you're looking at the beautiful face of Judy Garland. It's amazing.
I cannot get over that the costume budget of this movie alone wasn't $1 million.
Did you notice in Princess Carolyn's room, the non-vagina room, she has Russian Orthodox art on the walls of icons. Amongst them include an icon of Pete Townsend, sir not appearing in this picture.
They did so much with so little money.
I hope someone got to send Pete that piece of art for his house, because it's like really nice.
I hope he still has it.
It was probably burned.
One would hope that Roger would have seen that and been like, hey, can I take this home for my bandmate?
Yeah.
Because it's really nice. But yeah, there. I would say it's not cinematic fireworks when Roger Daltrey and Ringo Starr meet on screen for the first time.
I think in the context of the film, there is something being said with like, hey, here's the Pope, and he has a Liverpool accent. You're connecting like person to person in that way. I don't know anything about who the Pope was at that point in time. I'm sure that the Pope was probably not from a working class background, because this is a fucking power system. So why would he have been? So I don't know. But Ken Russell himself went through a Catholic phase. He briefly converted to Catholicism. So I feel like he probably was trying to put it's a sort of compassionate, down-to-earth guy kind of thing, but covered in the iconography of culture. And that was like why he treats why you have Ringo in that costume for that role.
Or there's something about making the Pope a beetle.
They are going to get married, and it seems like it's okay with everyone, but then it's not. And then Liszt becomes a monk.
Or he becomes an abbe, which ABBE with the accent mark that I know how to make it on the Mac keyboard, but not on a PC keyboard.
Right.
So they cut to the bridge where they're talking about what they're going to do with the rest of their lives now. What actually happened was they were about to get married, and then Princess Carolyn's family wanted her money, so it was not convenient to them to have her marry Liszt. So they went and talked to the Pope, and that was what put the brakes on it. But they had just been trying for so long that they were tired out. And she was in his life for the rest of his life, and she actually did write a 24-volume book with a really esoteric title against the Catholic Church.
Wow.
Can't blame her for being pissed.
No. So he becomes an abbé, and then we find him in bed with little Nell from Rocky Horror.
I was so excited into that.
I was so happy to see her, and I was like, I would like you to stay in the movie for longer. She looks amazing. She's got her gorgeous haircut. I love her.
Yeah, she has like a gangster's mall accent, and she has a gun, which is also, so in real life, Olga Janina, the woman she's supposed to be, was Liszt's stalker. And this happened when he was in his 60s. Lisztomania never died. Like, even when he was in like priest robes, that just amped it, because it's like, oh my gosh, he's forbidden fruit. Women were still throwing themselves at him when he was old. Olga Janina, Liszt's stalker, who dressed in men's clothes, always carried a bag containing the opium she was addicted to and a gun. And she wrote 4 bad memoirs about her time with Liszt, claiming they'd had an affair. She claimed to have grown up in a castle, but also she claims to have grown up in a castle, but also to have hunted wolves as a child and eaten them with her bare hands. She is not a mentally well person.
This woman is hashtag goals. I'm sorry. Like, everything you have just said, I'm like, I want this to be my life.
But it is to say that we don't know if they ever hooked up, even, because she's just so, like, stalkery, right? So maybe.
Well, Princess Carolyn said, like, knowing... Look, Liszt would bang anything. So Princess Carolyn insinuated she thought that he may have slept with her once or twice, or that it was probable that he did it and regretted it.
Got it. And then she kept obsessing about him. Yeah.
I mean, 4 volumes of books about the affair that she claimed to have. Like that, all of this is just like, is really singing to me in terms of like the kind of life I would like to live from this point forward. Yeah. So we are again greeted by Ringo Starr, who has come to, this is where the movie takes a real turn. The back third of this movie gets wild. And Ringo Starr informs him that he needs to go perform an exorcism on Wagner, who has started a cult, which Cosima has joined. And we've all been there. We go to Wagner's castle, and there's just a crew of blonde children wearing Superman capes and naked women.
Well, I mean, the entire movie shifts to being a Hammer horror film. It's like, and now we are in a Hammer horror film.
This is a wild turn. Rena, when you sent us the note that you said you were 10 minutes in and had to take a break,
I was like,
I know, I had just finished and I was like, dude, I don't know how you're going to feel about the last 30 minutes of this movie if you're taking a break now.
I was like, I need to pause here. I'm cataloging this mentally and emotionally, and I just need to take a step back. Wagner appears with an electric guitar and a Superman type costume, and he sings this song which includes lyrics like, "The flowering youth of Germany was raped by the beast."
It's everything's cool, and then it's not. And then we're just seeing these women. And this seems to be referential to a piece of art of some kind. I did not study art history, but the women dancing naked, I was like, this looks like something I've seen somewhere else. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't in the movie Animal House, which I wrote a paper on, so I don't know what it is.
It's a reference to the Rheingold, like with the naked virgins like dancing around the rock thing. So that, which has also been depicted in art a lot. So he's going right to that. Speaking of intimacy coordinators, like this is, I don't want to give somebody too much credit, but the story as told by Rick Wakeman was that like somebody from town had heard there was going to be like naked babes on set, and then like brought the ice cream truck around and all these people, and like Russell was horrified and like threatened to kill the gawkers and sent everybody out until it was like an appropriately skeleton crew of people on set again. So I was like, and the interview was old enough that I don't think that Rick Wakeman was saying it to try to make like Ken seem like a good guy. So I think it's probably true. Good on Ken for kicking out the gawkers before they shot that, I guess. So, but like literally, the guy, he was like, there was a fucking ice cream truck. There were townspeople, and but the girls were protected and did not have to perform in front of those people. So anyway, but like I just think it's so interesting just watch the movie completely shift genre and style and reference point entirely, like for the last third of the movie.
They do a pretty silly dance here, but there's some real tough lyrics happening here, including "The hour of the Aryan Superman is at hand," which I was like, yikes.
I mean, they're the villains, right? I appreciate that being made clear. Apparently people really need you to spell this out to them, because
They do, and
They're
then
so
even
bigoted
sometimes...
that, like people are like, yeah, the Empire and Empire Strikes Back's the good guys, right? I'm like, you're so bad at understanding art. Or at least your bigotry is so strong that you're incapable of interpreting art. So they're trying to make it very clear to you who the bad guys are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's very clear who's bad here.
I don't know what the safeguards were on child labor or how the parents of these many blonde child actors felt about their children goose stepping and chanting "We will be the master race," which you see.
This was before Alan Parker made Bugsy Malone, which introduced a whole new wave of child actor safety laws on set. I have questions about the parents who allowed their children to participate in this, as I have questions about a lot of child performer things that happen in movies. And we kind of find out that Wagner is essentially the Joker.
Wagner eventually welcomes him into the house. Wagner has a little science project going on.
Oh, does he ever?
And this reminds me more of the Frankenstein origin story than of the Superman one.
That's nothing to do with that at all. It's just doing Frankenstein. They have the levers, the layers of electricity.
Yeah, this reminded me a lot of Superman 3, which came after it. So I guess Superman 3 reminds of Lisztomania. But just the whole sequence at the end of that movie where they turn the sister into a robot, which scarred my childhood.
Is Superman 3 the one that is a Richard Pryor film that just happens to have Superman in it, or am I thinking of Superman 4?
Nope. That is the right movie.
Okay. So Richard Wagner has made a Superman Frankenstein who looks a lot like the Germanic god Thor and is played by Rick Wakeman, painted silver, like the Bond girl who is painted gold.
And you have to ask yourself, have these people all seen the Rocky Horror stage play in London that they could have all totally seen? So the Rocky Horror movie comes out the same year as this, but the play, and this is a British production, the play had been out before that.
So little Nell is in both in the same year.
Having quite a year.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was great when it all began. I was a regular Frankie fan. But it was over when he had the plan to start over.
Oh, you have a nice voice.
Man. Thank you. I'm pretty sure I'm not familiar with what the show looked like before it became a movie, but I'm pretty sure that this sequence did exist in Rocky Horror Picture Show, and it feels reasonable to assume that he's inspired by that in this. Probably did not expect there to be a Rocky Horror Picture Show movie beat that was going to be on screen when his project was, in fact, though, because it's all just happening so close together. But yeah.
Yeah, this feels like the part of the script that he didn't really get to fully fleshing out, because it does feel like it borrows, like, Elana, I saw in the background of one of your headshots that you have a gorgeous Phantom of the Paradise poster, which is a movie that I also I love, and it feels like we're drawing a little bit, like we're picking things up from all over the place, and obviously that's different source material, but there were things about what was happening here with Wagner where I was like, this feels like other things that existed in the culture around the same time.
Yeah, totally. I fucking love that movie. Obviously, I'll say what a poster from it. But yeah, I thought you were really astute to draw that comparison. And of course, everybody always talks about that movie and Rocky Horror together because they're both the rock musical horror films of that age. It is very. I love Paul Williams.
Oh my God. We were talking about Paul Williams. He's in our Doors episode.
He is, right. It's right.
Yes.
He plays a publicist who seems a lot like Truman Capote in the factory scenes.
I can see that. Paul Williams is amazing. Paul Williams should have been in this movie also. I feel like if he could have been in England at the same time, he would have also been in this movie.
He, in theory, should have been, because he was about to start making Bugsy Malone.
Oh my God. Okay,
Like, he should have been free to go over and just hop on this set for a day.
Right.
Other people were there.
The final act is like they're combining a number of different horror movie tropes and themes going on. With the terrified villager. He basically cast like they literally give Daltrey the Jonathan Harker hair from the movie. Like, you're like, oh, that's why they blew his hair out, because I associate that look with straight hair from the character from there. So like they're just going to straight up go and do that, except it's about Wagner and Liszt.
There's one point in the end too where von Bülow looks like Christopher Lee in Dracula.
Oh, yeah, totally. Christopher Lee was supposed to play the therapist in Tommy, but he had to be somewhere else, and Jack Nicholson was like, I love you, Ken Russell, can I be in your movie? And Ken Russell was like, yes, Jack Nicholson, you can definitely be in my movie. We'll just come by, we'll fit you in somewhere. That's how Jack Nicholson ended up in Tommy, though, was like him being a fan.
Yeah, just like because he certainly can't sing, but he's delightful in that scene.
Yeah, and Christopher Lee can sing, so you can see how that would have been the original plan there.
Yeah.
So Sarah, you have the note here about the Rick Wakeman Thor Frankenstein Superman. His Superman is quite violent and wants to drink and be stupid.
That's it in a nutshell.
Well, yeah, there's a bunch of puns about Stein, and it turns into a stein of beer, which Rick Wakeman gilded Superman Frankenstein drinks, and then he pisses into the fireplace, and Wagner knees him in the balls, and Liszt says that he looks like something out of a comic.
And that's the one moment in the movie where I was like, this is lampshading a little bit hard, guys.
What's lampshading?
Like, don't look at the thing I'm about to tell you that's about to happen. They don't trust that I recognize this, so they're telling me. And I'm like, yeah, guys, I know.
Oh, I see.
Like, don't worry, we can all tell. You didn't need to point that out. I mean, I don't know. Maybe somebody's great grandmother couldn't tell, but the majority of the audience, I think, would probably have been. Actually, wait, I take it all back. A point that I'm going to make later is actually about how little people did know. So never mind. To me as a viewer now, I'm like, yeah, it's a little bit like a comic book, ain't it? But yeah, I guess at the time he felt like he had to explain that to people. And he might have been right.
One of the things, I guess, having Richard Wagner wake an Aryan Superman like Frankenstein creature feels to me like a perversion of the Golem of Prague story. And one of the things that makes Wagner doing this terrible thing with a Germanic Superman especially jarring is that Superman and Batman were created by Jews, and that Superman is a metaphor. And Captain America.
Every superhero. Yeah. Just keep going. Anyway.
All of Marvel, all of DC, practically every superhero was invented and initially designed by Jews. Superman is metaphorical for the World War II era Jewish American refugee experience. He is a survivor of a gifted, ancient, destroyed race who hides behind a nerdy persona, suppressing himself as Clark Kent to blend in as a stranger in a strange land. This was an immediately relatable experience for Jews fleeing Europe, and I've been astonished when I meet Jewish comic book fans who don't know how many DC and Marvel superheroes were created by Jewish writers and artists. But I don't read comic books, so I don't know any of the particulars that a comic book nerd might take exception to here. Fortunately, Elana knows everything about comic books.
I don't know everything, but I do have thoughts. So I had seen your notes, and I felt like there was a real sense of horror from you to see like Jewish text be treated this way. And what I think is important to remember is at the time this film was made, all of that knowledge about the Jewish cultural history within comics was not something that anybody was talking or thinking about, because this was basically considered trash culture. All of those Jewish writers were like writing under like kind of less obviously Jewish forms of their names. And all of these things where you and I are looking at Peter Parker and we're like, that kid's Jewish. Like it was all subtext. You're like a fucking British goy. You don't even know any Jewish people. You don't understand any of this to be Jewish. And then that was true for most readers. That's how it gets under the wire. And while, Stan Lee began doing his campus tours where he would talk about how comics are really intellectual at the invitation of college students who liked comics and wanted somebody to come and validate that, like, yes, you're not a fucking ingrate for liking this. They weren't talking about it through the Jewish cultural history lens at all. They were talking about how Doctor Strange is referencing different artists and philosophers and all these things, but none of it had to do with Judaism. So nobody is talking about how Jewish all this shit is. So of course, a British filmmaker who's not of a generation that grew up thinking of comics as a legitimate art hears the name Superman and thinks, oh, this is about Nazis. He doesn't even know these guys are fucking Jewish. Ken Russell's born in 1924 or something like that. Like, the British relationship with American comic books is interesting because in the UK, they would always get American comics way, way later than us, a lot fewer and cost more money. And then they'd have a lot of British knockoffs that like were pretend to be American comics, but weren't American comics. So like people would be like, oh, that American comic, like not the Ringo Kid is a real American comic, but like the Green Cowboy, I'm just making the name. We're like, yeah, that's not a thing. That's not a thing. They're like, oh, okay. So like, they're drawing on the story that you shared is one that's very much informed by the post Michael Chabon awareness that the public has of comics history. And in 75, none of that existed. So I think everything you just said, if you told Ken Russell, he'd be like, no shit. Huh. Okay. Like it was not on anybody's radar. So I just have to watch this pretending that I don't know all these things that I know. If you're a British guy born in 25 and you probably think comics are vaguely right wing because they involve violence, you probably think that they're, pro-violent propaganda, right? You have the Superman comic being treated as a pamphlet of Wagner's pro-Wagner violence. Like basically all of Ken Russell's takes on comics are wrong, but that's okay because he did not have any good information to extrapolate any of this of. And like, I don't blame him for being wrong about comics is sort of where I am on it. So it's not really about comics, which is interesting because there's a number of other things that this movie depicts that he's also very wrong about because of the perspective he's coming in. He just does not have like the information about it. But it's not classical music is the thing. That's the difference. He's like, actually like he loves classical music. He like got really into classical music when he had like a nervous breakdown. And he was like a teenager or something like that. And like just listen to all this classical music on the radio and like really developed this passion for it. But yeah, like, so, is this anything like the movie that you or I would make as Jewish people who read comics about, and no, but I just have to view it as like, this isn't that. He's basically saying, here's a pop culture artifact that is wildly popular, that shows over the top cartoonish depictions of violence. And I see how this can be propaganda that's used to propagandize the youth towards violence. It sounds a little bit like Verdeman, right? The bad guy, mm-hmm. But like, that's where he's coming on it. At least Ken Russell knows the Nazis are the bad guys. But again, he's British. So his take on Y is not the same as your and I take on Y. We'll get to that shortly. If you look at it as like, I guess if you don't know anything about Superman and you hear the name Superman, you think it's probably has something to do with the Supermenschen and not understand that it's a subversion. So, and I liked that he went for Thor and not the American Superman as the ultimate manifestation of this, because it's also like owning up with this mythology. Also, I believe this is Rick Wakeman's first like acting performance. So, I mean,
and he's great.
He's just a man who likes to perform on stage wearing giant capes and make the escapades. He's very theatrical, so it's certainly far from his first time being the center of the stage, but I think the first time perhaps not playing Rick Wakeman.
Then we have a fight where there's some fire and pianos. It's wild. Liszt is not necessarily taking the threat of Wagner seriously, which we all know around here is not a great idea to not take the Nazis who say they're Nazis seriously.
Yeah, he thinks that. So he thinks that he can stop Wagner by getting him to drink holy water, but that doesn't work. And then he's like, oh, I should be fighting him with my music. So like you mentioned, Sarah, there's a bunch of stuff with flaming pianos, and we see the second of some reveals that Wagner has his hair in curlers, and there's foam and snakes. I had no clue what was happening the first time I watched this scene.
Nope. But It seems like what they're saying is that the power of music is more powerful than the symbols of Catholicism in combating evil, which is a message I support.
Ken Russell converted to Catholicism and then left the church after how shittily he was treated over making The Devils, which is another great example of a movie where it's like, if the church weren't assholes, they would understand that this is actually a very pro-Christian movie. Like, and apparently the Jesuits did get it. The Jesuits, and he felt validated. They just were like, see, this is like actually, pro-Christian. It's just against like bad Christians and for good Christians. I think like Ken Russell was definitely having his feels about the church in this scene and how he'd become embittered by its not understanding somebody trying to tell a story that was complicated and just being against it because there's boobs. There's boobs in the art. I don't get whatever. There's so many boobs.
Yeah.
So Wagner is crushed under a bunch of rocks. Cosima is upset, and she talks about his decadent religion, and we see her bringing out the voodoo doll again. And the movie gets really figurative here, and I have no idea what's going on because I'm like shamefully literal minded.
I have a note that just says, is this what we're saying? Does it matter what we're saying?
They lead the child army through the streets of unclear, but some town in which the vampire castle exists, and they shoot with machine guns all of the very cartoonish, like Jewish villagers.
Yeah, I'm not sure how I feel about Jewish representation in this film. They're all like men with beards, wearing suits and carrying big gold Jewish stars around, and they go on pogrom at them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was a little on the nose.
The thing is, so like, okay, they are being the villagers in the early horror films, like not the Hammer horror films, the older horror films. So that they're like the cartoonish thing is like it is not how I would want to represent things that were literally done to my family. However, Ken Russell doesn't think that he's making a film about pogroms and the plight of the Jewish people. Ken Russell thinks he's making a movie about the power of art and about the British trauma of World War II. So we're getting now to like something that's kind of become a thesis of mine, and I regret not talking to any of my actual British friends about this before bringing this to you. And the perfect person to have talked about this with would have been Stephen Atwell, our late friend, an American historian with an entirely British family, who would have had a really astute take on this. But I think that the lens that the British people use to approach stories about World War II is completely different than the ones that Americans have, and especially different from us American Jews. To the British people, World War II is about that time that Germans bombed them in their house. And they don't care about anybody else's trauma but their own. And I kind of get, like, that is really bad. That time you were bombed and you were a small child, that I can see that might be your primary association with this thing. So they don't think about, like, we're not even in their story. Do you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So he's doing a stock early horror film, Todd Browning horror Dracula story. Those aren't Jews. Those are villagers from the Todd Browning film. To me, as a Jewish person whose grandparents were literally in like concentration camps, I can't fathom doing a story about pogroms or the Holocaust or any of that isn't actually about the things that happen to Jewish people. But that's not what they're doing. He's doing something about the British people responding, like how, like the Germans tried to ruin the world, but we came back with our culture and our love and music and art that transcends above that. And like this isn't about Jews in any meaningful way. Now, I would tell people, if you're not comfortable watching shit like that, I don't blame you. I get it. But like, this isn't about me or you in any real way. This is about Ken Russell and like having been a child during the Blitz.
I'm 100% on board for this theory.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, me too. It's Cosima leads the children on pogrom. Sara, you have the note here. This is a pretty goofy ending because it shows at some point in here Liszt died, metaphorically, literally, figuratively, I have no idea.
She stabs him and you see him kind of collapse, but it is not emphasized. I wasn't sure that was the death.
You see him sitting around in heaven with like 7 of his ladies playing a harp. And I don't understand how Cosima wound up in heaven with her dad and all his mistresses, because we have no redemption sequence on her. The voice of God tells them that Wagner is up to no good down on Earth, and they go down to fix it, and they take a spaceship from the afterlife to go back to Earth and fight the Richard Wagner Frankenstein Hitler creature. The spaceship, in a bit of 70s design, has a pointy nose like the Concorde, but it has angel wings. And I decided here that this spaceship from the afterlife is the other end of the horseshoe from the dinosaur rule. We don't talk about scores before we give them, but where, yeah, we have an automatic 0 for accuracy, even though Ken Russell did get a lot of things right that showed that he knew his material, not for being wrong about everything, but because this is the futuristic equivalent to the dinosaur rule, is having Franz Liszt, his mistresses, and his daughter take a spaceship from the afterlife back to Earth to go fight the Richard Wagner Hitler Frankenstein Superman.
It's the most, like, exquisitely literal Deus Ex Machina in the history of ever. It's literally a god machine.
Yeah. Oh, nice. Well done. I love it. That's great.
Like, it's actually, like, and they go smite Frankenstein Wagner.
And they sing a song about love, and they have, like, it's, like, very, very literal. They have lyrics all about that shit.
I've said so many things in this episode that I never thought I would say about a movie or in this podcast, like that Franz Liszt is riding a giant penis to greatness drawn by women like dogs at an Iditarod race. Iditarod race, or spaceship from the afterlife to kill Richard Wagner, Hitler, Frankenstein.
What a wild joy.
I love putting all the women together, each having their own note, even though George Sand was probably not actually one of his lovers. She's there too. And sending them off to, like, kill the Nazis, like, in a big, big, glorious ending.
Marie was pretty sure that Franz was sleeping with George Sand, and it may have happened.
Okay, cool.
And Marie was jealous of everyone, because even though she was his out-of-wedlock mistress, she wanted him all to herself.
I'm glad that you, like, are, again, backing up Ken Russell, like, knowing his shit. My big thesis about what the film is about is ultimately this is not about Liszt or Wagner. It's a movie that's about what is art for. Is art supposed to be propaganda for the state or for the church? Is art for getting girls to fuck you, or for jostling for position against your friends? Or is art an exorcism to get rid of these bad things? Or is art for a force of love? And, you know, you have a lot of statements being made between Princess Carolyn and Wagner about, and Liszt about the meaning of art. And so I think that ultimately that's what this movie is about.
Yeah, it wouldn't go so far off book if it weren't about, like, proving something. And so we have, Corpse Capers is a segment that we do where weird things happen to the body after somebody dies. So IRL, Cosima elder abused Liszt on his deathbed.
That's so awful. It makes me so sad. Like I think he's a terrible dad, but, like, just so don't visit him. Don't elder abuse him, though. You know what I mean?
His death scene is really sad, but in terms of Corpse Keepers, first of all, there are multiple instances of Cosima being really weird with dead bodies. For example, when Wagner died, again, from Oliver Hilm, time and again, she returned to the body, lying down beside it or on top of it, kissing and stroking it. She even spent a night in bed with the corpse. When they finally have the funeral for Liszt, they only play Wagner's music at it. Liszt,
Evil!
So, and Liszt died during the Beirut Festa. Am I saying Beirut or Beirut? I don't know how you fucking pronounce it. It's German.
Beirut? Oh, I don't know shit about. Sorry.
It's spelled Bayreaut. It's the city in Germany where they have the big Wagner festival. Liszt was in town for this festival that Cosima throws for her husband, so going to visit her dad while he's dying was a big pain because it meant she had to take time away from the festival for her ghastly fascist husband and his music. Cosima refuses to bring a priest in to give him last rites, and since Cosima was unwilling to have her father's body in Wanfried, she had arranged for an official supper to be held there that evening. The body was simply left at the Frolics. That's the house he was staying at. According to Schnapphoff, Frau Frohlich expressed her disapproval of the fact that the body was being laid out in her house without so much as a by your leave. Her annoyance increased when a large crowd of onlookers gathered outside the house. Yada yada about townsfolk. When the body began to putrefy on account of the high temperature, and Isolde became ill with the smell, Frohlich finally lost his temper, laying into Schnapphoff and ordering him to remove the body forthwith, as he and his wife had other tenants, and had no wish for an epidemic to break out within their four walls. Unless Liszt's body was taken away, he would immediately call the police. So Cosima finally has the body removed. Franz Liszt's mortal remains were finally collected in an ordinary hand cart. Frau Cosima took the feet, and I took the head. The coffin was wheeled into Wanfried through a side entrance and placed on an improvised trestle in the hall. And then they have the funeral where they only play Wagner music. And Cosima and the grandchildren are all busy with their festival. And Franz Liszt is buried in the municipal cemetery in Bayreuth because his horrendous Nazi daughter thought that burying him there would help draw visitors to the festival honoring her ghastly husband. She sucks eggs and I hate her.
Yeah.
She died in 1930 and they were early adopters on Nazism.
Oh, I'm sure.
That's all repulsive information that you just shared with us.
Yeah, corpse capers, everybody. So, choice dialogue. So 3 lines of dialogue that I liked were, pigs, if you please, but aristocratic pigs, not bourgeois. Bollocks, I don't speak Hungarian. And, no, Wagner, stay in hell, where you belong.
She speaks some truth there, right?
Yep.
Which is hard because I really love this one quote that's given to Wagner in the film, which is, the piano is propaganda. I'm like, oh, I love that. Damn it. Marie at the end giving the epitaph, the best of us lives on, enshrined in his music for everyone to share forever. And then this amazing Princess Carolyn bit. Europe is ripe with revolution. You will be the leader of the only one that matters, the revolution in music. The whole world will sing your songs of brotherhood. Art is so much greater than politics. Obviously, art is politics, but it's a great quote. Anyway.
That's the same line I had. I loved that.
It's so fucking good.
Sara, can you please give our listeners a quick refresher about how we score movies?
I'd be happy to. We rate movies on a 1 to 10 scale across 10 areas that we find to be subjectively and or objectively important to most films, but specially tailored to the issues particular to biopics. If you want more details on how we score movies, please scroll down our webpage at biopicapodcaststory.podbean.com. You'll also find a record of our scores for past episodes there. And with that out of the way, let's score this thing. And Rena, how would you like to do scoring tonight? Should I read mine all the way through, or should we bounce them around?
Let's bounce them. Okay. So for outward appearances, makeup, and hair, I gave it a 2 because it did some things that were fabulous, but none of them looked remotely like, nobody looked like who they were supposed to be. Nothing much looked period accurate.
Yeah, I went 7 on this because I just loved it for what it was.
I am a monster. Alana?
No, you're not.
I mean, I questioned it because I was sort of like, I don't want to judge this on a thing which it's not, you know. I think that they are successfully channeling the aesthetic of the personas they're inhabiting, whether that relates to necessarily everything real, like the making the point of Liszt as a rock star seems as sound as any, you know, could be. I just, everybody looks so great. I can't not give them like a high score. I'm going to give it like an 8. But if we're going to just rate for style on its own, I would say like 10 out of 10.
Okay. For acting and casting, do they capture the spirit of who they are playing? Beyond that, is the acting good? Everyone's very invested in who they're playing. They do an excellent job capturing the spirit. But it's like, this movie broke my brain, because on the other hand, so I based it on my ambivalence, and the average of 10 and 0 is 5 for acting and casting.
I gave it an 8. I think, you know, in terms of like capturing the spirit of things, like everybody captured very much the spirit of what the intent was.
Again, this movie is so much more interesting for not being masterpiece theater. Like, I will never forget it, which is more than I can say about a ton of things we've watched that like played by the book. But Elana?
I was surprised to find that Princess Carolyn did actually have a passing resemblance to Sarah Kellerman. I think that there's a difference in quality in Daltrey's performances between when he's being Liszt on stage versus when he's being Liszt doing things other than being on stage. He's very, very good at being a rock star, and his Chaplin impression is impressive, and is impressive for a non-actor in the traditional sense. But he's not like a great actor, like in general. So I don't know, but also this movie wouldn't exist if like he wasn't that role. I'm gonna say a 7. Wait, what did you give it, Sarah?
I gave it an 8. I'm super generous to actors. Okay.
I'm gonna give it an 8. I'm gonna give it an 8 too.
For passage of time, I gave it a 1. I had no idea where and when we were, or how much time was passing.
I gave it a 2. Same.
I gave it a 2. I don't know. Especially because nobody really ate. Cosima didn't even eat.
For costuming, I gave it a 3 because, yes, it did things that were fabulous, but it didn't look just based on who I am, and that I love reading about actual fashion history, and I love things where they make an effort. So the 3 is me being generous, because the piano key bathrobe is kind of fabulous. Sarah?
I give it a 9. I loved the costumes. I know that they were anachronistic and crazy, but I also gave it, you know, just the extra push too of just the fact that they did so much on so little budget. And yeah, and just like the details that went into the costume, there was a lot of love and care in using those costumes to be part of executing the vision and to work really closely with everything else that was going on.
I get, because if I watched something that was supposed to take place in 1965 and it was wrong, which happens all the time, I'd be livid. So I understand that, like in concept, but the outfits are so fucking cool. How could I not love it? Like, the one more I'll shout out is the bat wings that Princess Carolyn has in her negligee. I think is related. I think it's from a Theda Bara costume, but I couldn't find the exact image that I wanted to be. But like, it is a specific outfit. Anyway, give it a 10.
Awesome. For quality of the script, I gave it a 6. There was some dialogue that I love, and again, reflecting my ambivalence because this movie broke my brain. Sarah?
I gave it a 4, mostly just because I felt like the back end of it was out of ideas and were out of ways to end this. But also, I think I'm also like giving it that because I know it was 57 pages long.
Yeah. I gave it a 7.
For accuracy, dinosaur rule, 0. And there were a number of things where Ken Russell showed that he knew his stuff, as I mentioned. But dinosaur rule, horseshoe equals 0. Sara?
I gave it a 1. He got everything right in a sense, but then it just, you show me a Wagner Frankenstein dressed up as Hitler, and I'm like, you know what? We're not making a movie about the things that actually happened anymore.
So normally I will give a point for at least having the names of people in history to thank the film for trying to get people interested in history and attempting to show events that happened in these people's lives, even if it is wildly inaccurate. I gave The Conqueror 2 points for accuracy because it did use the names Genghis Khan, Bortai, Jamuka, people who actually lived, and it was loosely based on an actual event that happened in the life of Genghis Khan, where his first wife, Bortai, was kidnapped, although that happened when they were like 10 and 13, not like 56 and 30-something, as it appears in The Conqueror. So I was like, I have to give this a 2. But, dinosaur rule. Elana?
I gave it a 3 because I think it speaks to some truth of the artist. While I am by no means an expert at romantic music, I think that there's some real dedication to sharing the music of Liszt through Rick Wakeman's score. And Rick Wakeman really is an ambassador of classical music to the rock audience.
Storytelling, was it cliched? Was it interesting? Was it inventive? I gave it an 8. It's wildly original, very inventive. I was never bored. And I do not believe we will ever see storytelling devices like this again.
I gave it a 10, and if I could go higher, I would.
I gave it a 9 only because I know he can do better. Like, he's made movies that they're always as baroque and campy and unhinged, but in his best movies, they do also make quote unquote more sense, quote unquote.
Production value, I gave it a 5, which was, again, I want to give it a really low score, but it's not trying to please people like me.
I give it a 9. I think that it far surpassed even like the production quality of a lot of movies that have 20 times, 30 times that budget. The artistry and the care that went into unifying all of the elements, I found like incredibly impressive.
Yes, I gave it a 10 because what more can we possibly get from a budget that small than so many iconic looks and set pieces?
Production, direction, decision making, I gave it an 8 because all of the things I objected to don't really matter since they contributed to they contributed to an anachronistic fabulousness that was nonetheless admirable.
I gave it a 9, except for like the parts that we talked about that felt a little bit like rushed and tacked on and stolen. I think that they made a lot of really interesting choices that aligned so well with the thesis statement of the film.
Yeah, I gave it a 9 only because, again, I know he can do better, and we can show those examples. I do want to jump actually to add this to the casting question earlier, which is I think it is very important that they cast, while Roger Daltrey is not a great pianist, he is a pianist. And in many films where they have people playing musicians, that person cannot believably play the instrument that they're playing, and it results in a worse performance. The decision to cast someone who can play piano as a person who is predominantly a pianist is good. And it is appreciated that the acting of him in that role is that much better in that they don't have to cut around whether or not he's actually playing. And not only is they actually play, you are actually hearing him. I'm like 90% certain from what I've read that you're actually hearing him play on the stage in the ones where he is playing. So like That's an important part of the performance, you know? So he had only recently learned how to play piano, like a couple of years before, right? Just in time for this movie. So.
I love it.
So for Do We Care? I gave it a 2 because I don't care about the versions of these people that were happening in this.
I gave it a 5, which is low for me because I tend to be empathic and feel tremendous sympathy for every movie and every character all the time. Because of the way the film is structured, it is more something to look at rather than something to emotionally connect with the characters and their choices. Especially because those things are so outlandish. I don't think that Ken Russell is incapable of making you feel love and compassion and alignment with characters' emotions. Just this movie isn't about that.
So do we care? Well, as someone who just generally speaking does not care about classical music, even though Ken Russell really wants me to, this did make me care about Liszt, which I didn't really before, even though I was fascinated by the concept of him as this pop star. So on taking me from a scale of not caring at all to caring somewhat, I gave it an 8 for increasing my ratio of caring. Now, do I care more about Liszt than I do about the prog rock soundtrack or the works of Ken Russell overall? No, but I do care more and I know more about it. And yeah.
I would also, I don't know when I'm supposed to add this, but I would like to use my buy this week. So I will be adding a point to my score because I want to bulk it up.
Buy is a concept where we are allowed to add 1 point to our average or subtract 1 point if we feel that our score does not reflect
right.
the viewing experience. So my total came to a 4.
Mine came to a 6.4, and with the buy, it brings it up to a 7.4. And it. They don't make them like this anymore. Like, I know we talked about this when we went to see Cats, which isn't necessarily a fair reference to make to this movie, but just like the idea of a movie getting to the screen with this level of insanity is a miracle.
Oh yeah, it could only happen in the 70s, and I will always remember this movie.
So mine is 7.6.
Okay, you're permitted to use the buy if you want.
So then it's 8.6.
Lisztomania, your total average score came to 6.66666666666, and it rounds up to the 7. You
Perfect.
did not earn a second opinion, but boy, are you one of a kind.
There's nothing like this.
Except other Ken Russell films that are similar.
Yes.
I'm not from the same planet as this movie. Are any of us from the same planet as Ken Russell, figuratively? I don't know.
I mean, ostensibly, yes. I might be from the same
I would
planet.
love
I
to
think,
be.
yeah, I think you're likelier than either of us to be from the same planet as Ken Russell.
I would love to be from Planet Ken Russell. And there's so many movies that I would like to see the Ken Russell version of. I want to see Ken Russell's Cats. I want to see
you know, I really do want to see The Music Lovers and Mahler, and like apparently you actually can see he did a film about a composer who I'd never heard of. Is available for free in its entirety on YouTube that I wish I had thought to look up, but I never fucking heard this composer. He also has a Debussy. The Debussy film is the one that stars that connected him with Oliver Reed for the first time. But yeah, the Song of Summer is in '68. It's about Frederic Deloul. I don't know this composer. Like, this is how obscure he is, but it's one of Ken Russell's favorite films of Ken Russell. And that you could watch in its entirety for free on the internet. But a great number of these classical music films are not available easily on streaming. And I think it's interesting that this big part of his work is just not available to us. But the Liszt film is. I also want to share the description that Amazon Prime has of adjectives people have used to describe the Liszt movie. If you go to look it on Amazon Prime, it says, description adjectives are fantasy, comedy, confused, strange. And you've got all the biopic where the opening descriptor is fantasy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of a kind. So, other stuff that you should watch instead. I can't say to watch a thing instead of Lisztomania because there is nothing like it in the world. You will never forget it. It is not in my wheelhouse, but I am one person with issues. I would say listen to Hungarian Rhapsody if you want to get a good sample of Liszt. And yeah, you can watch a bazillion 19th century costume dramas that do all the things that I like and forget about them. Sara?
I mean, people should definitely see this movie. You will never see anything like it before or again in your life. If you can seek out Women in Love, it's I would say a more narratively accessible film than this, but also just contains like utterly magical performance from Glenda Jackson and from Oliver Reed, who is wonderful. I recommend Tommy with an asterisk. That has like a back third issue too, but so does the album. It's a one of a kind vision. It's completely original. Anne Margaret is amazing in it and leaves it all on the floor in that movie. He is the author and the captain of all of his things.
I also think his wife's costume work in all of this early stuff of his is huge. Like, and I don't know that it would keep up from there without her, because this is just some visionary costumes. And
yeah, they're just so critical to it. Like Baz Luhrmann's wife is Catherine Martin, who does all of his costumes. Like those are really important to the storytelling of his work. He's the star, but like that kind of design is so important to the storytelling too.
Yeah, I definitely think everybody needs to see Tommy. And I The Devils is really this one of the best films ever. But I think Rena, you might like his film Gothic, which is based on a certain weekend with a certain wow, my brain really fell out of my ear.
It's the weekend that Mary Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Mary's sad sack stepsister Claire Claremont, Lord Byron, and some other guy got together, and Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. Yeah. Lord Byron wrote a thing. Someone wrote a vampire story, and it was a rainy weekend by a lake in Italy. Yes, I know this story.
And that one has accurate costumes, so you won't be upset about it.
I love the Regency too.
And this definitely left me wanting to try to see some of his like classical music films that are harder to track down. So
yeah, if you want to learn more about Franz Liszt, listen to the Biographers 6-part podcast.
But yeah, I mean, like, honestly, like my ultimate like what else to watch thing is like obviously I love this movie, or else I wouldn't have told you guys to watch it with me. But it isn't the best Ken Russell movie, so that's kind of the only caveat, is that like there are even better ones.
So it is plug time. Elana, before we go, do you have anything coming up that you would like to plug?
Oh, yes. If you're interested in comics at all, you should definitely listen to my podcast, Graphic Policy Radio. Even if you're not interested in comics, I know we are about to hit publish on an episode about the DC animated series Creature Commandos. And when it becomes time for Andor Season 2, you will want to come to Graphic Policy for the Andor coverage, because I have actual historians with expertise on world revolutions and dissent and protest who come on my show to talk about Andor. Because it's that kind of nerd podcast. We like bring the experts to talk about the things.
Oh my God, I love this.
And if you like to care about me blabbing about music, I will indeed be talking about some of the founders of country rock, Graham Parsons and Chris Hillman, on Junk Filter in the near future. Everybody can definitely go follow me on Blue Sky, where I am way too much with my handle Levin. That's Levin. And my Medium is another good dumping ground where various essays that have appeared in other places will also live for your convenience. and my medium is at ELANA_Levin. But yeah, Graphic Policy Radio is my main personal podcast. My link tree is linktr.ee/ELANALEVIN.
We'll put links to all of these in our show notes as well.
Awesome.
Elana, thank you so much for coming on my birthday episode.
Yeah. No, this has been a blast. Thank you for letting me bring the least biopic of the biopics.
Thank you for bringing us Lisztomania. And yeah, I think Rena and I were just tripping over each other to praise you and to thank you for being a guest on our show. And thank you so much for your time and for bringing this movie into our lives. It is magical and unforgettable and just crazy fun.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you so much. And we want to have you back for the Devils or anytime really. And with that, I will take us out. If you like the show, please leave us a 5-star rating and subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and tell a friend, or better yet, plural friends, and share us on social media. We hear it helps. You can follow us on Threads, Blue Sky, and Instagram, where we have visual aids from our episodes. Our Instagram handle is at Biopic a Podcast Story, so do check us out there, and we'll link to that in our show notes as well. Please also check out our webpage at biopicapodcaststory.podbean.com to see the official episode ratings for all of the movies that we've done so far. And if you would like to get in touch, you can email us at biopiclistenermailbag@gmail.com.
Tune in next week when we'll be talking about Walk the Line, one of the most requested films, and also one of the films responsible for the most often repeated cliches in modern biopic making.
This is going to be a come down.
Yep.
And with that, I'm so happy you guys finally met.
Same.
See everybody next week, and good night to the earnest and the cynical.
Good night.
I love that.
Good night.